How about that? Okay. Let's try it again. Good morning, everybody. Is that better? Okay. Stopping hacks, data abuse, and disinformation in Europe. What works and who's responsible? You know, 10 years ago, a conversation like that would only really be happening in a place like this with media insiders and people with an interest in the industry. But I think that changed with the last US presidential election. We know historically that legislation and regulation always lags behind innovation. Doesn't matter whether you're talking about the internet or social media or even electronic cigarettes. Nonetheless, the power to harness social media for disinformation is truly staggering, and it's clear that the media and regulators are playing catch up. What we're going to try to do this morning over the next 35 minutes, because I've been warned by my colleagues from Vienna that we have to be on time, is we're going to look at the extent of the problem, have a look at what's been done so far, and then with the experts, look ahead and see what further changes might need to be made. We're very lucky to be joined by panelists in Geneva this morning with insights from both the world of social media and the regulatory side. So let me introduce them to you, and I'll ask them to come up to the stage as I call them. First of all, Stephen Turner, who is head of public policy at Twitter in Belgium. Arndt Haller is Google's legal director. Nicole Romain is head of communications at the Vienna-based UN Agency for Fundamental Rights. Philipp Metzinger is Director General of the Swiss Federal Office of Communications. Pascal Doucet-Bon, last but not least, is the Deputy Director of News at France Télévisions. Please welcome them to the stage. I would love to have one other guest here today. I won't tell you from which company, but it starts with face and it ends with book. Let's not speculate as to why they're not here or why they maybe aren't at a lot of these gatherings at the moment, but I'm sure over the course of the conversation you'll maybe form your own opinions. So let's kick off. I suppose the first thing to do is to try to get a sense of the extent of this problem. Nicole, I suppose it's worth pointing out, if I could start with you first, your agency doesn't set industry standards and you don't make laws or anything like that, even though you do have a title that makes you sound like you're very much an EU institution. But you have conducted an awful lot of empirical research into data abuse and hate speech online and things like that. And you found that there are very clear patterns that show that certain people are targeted an awful lot more than others. Can you maybe bring us through a little bit of that to start with? You do.
Okay, it works. Good morning, everybody. Nicole Romain from the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights, which is in Vienna. And as already mentioned, we're not a standard setting or monitoring agency of the EU. We are a decentralized EU body, working independently from the EU institutions in Brussels, and mainly doing research, surveys. If I say research, I will have people criticizing me for that. But we are carrying out a lot of large-scale surveys in the EU, across the EU member states. And just to name a few, in 2009, we carried out the very first European Union Minorities and Discrimination Survey, where we looked at various ethnic minority groups in the EU and the way they were facing discrimination in the various EU member states. At that point in time, cyber harassment was not yet on the table. However, we've carried out a second wave of this minority survey in 2016. And surprisingly, in this survey, we did say that most harassment actually is in a face-to-face situation. When people are in public space, they get discriminated. So also here, online harassment or discrimination or hate speech is not really the main issue. However, in two other big surveys which we've carried out, one, violence against women in 2014, it was very clear already that cyber harassment plays a great role. More than 11% of women have faced, in 2013, that was when we did the face-to-face interviews, cyber harassment, which means they were faced with hate speech, with discrimination, with stalking through the web online. And 5 years ago, that's quite a long time if you think about the evolution of information and communication technologies, we already called on the EU institutions that there is a need for policy frame to come into place to actually protect potential victims and also give them a voice to have to bring it to the courts, their cases. The next part, the latest survey was an online survey of Jewish people perceiving discrimination and hate crime. And here it becomes evident that within the last 5 years there has been a great development with discrimination online. Most Jews perceive hate speech, discrimination online in social media, 89%. And just to give you a little comparison, compared to political life, and we all know that in various EU member states, and even in the one from where the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights is situated, in Austria, hate speech online has increased against Jews. And in the political life, it's only 70% of Jews who perceive hate speech. So you see here the development from 2014. Of course, there are more women living in the EU than Jews, but still the problem has become far more dominant.
There is clearly a very real problem here, and I think it's the one thing that everybody can agree on. Stephen from Twitter, it's obviously not your fault personally, but you've created a bit of a monster here, haven't you? I mean, if we look at certain people's Twitter feeds, it would give you a pretty bleak view of the world. And I think the perception is that not enough is done to filter or to intervene on the industry's part. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think, oh yeah, sorry, thank you. Thank you for the question. And thank you, just to start, thank you so much for inviting me to be here to discuss this issue. I think, yeah, depending on where you go, but this, on Twitter, the real issue is that Twitter is alive, it's public, and it's conversational. So you have accounts from individuals such as journalists tweeting alongside individual citizens, users, and politicians. So you have such a wide breadth of discussions, and they're all taking place in a live public discussion. So you can really see and sense the emotion, the feeling around a sporting event. Liverpool wins, you see the excitement from the UK, from the fans. But after an election, you also see the excitement from different parts of political parties, political groups. You know, the Greens have done well, so you see like this green wave, and you see that conversation on Twitter. So I think when we start to interact with individual accounts, there are some that are loud, some discussions that are a little bit uncomfortable, and then there are those bad actors where that's where we dedicate our time, including putting a main focus on trying to address the health of the conversation. And that's really been the goal for Twitter for this past year and going forward, trying to address those malicious actors and those who are out to really do harm to others on the platform.
Is there an inevitability about some of these abuses, Arnd Haller? I mean, if you concentrate a lot of money in one place, it's likely that it's a risk that it's going to get robbed. If we collect massive amounts of data, as your company does, with our permission, sometimes people don't realize it, but we are giving our permission, is it not inevitable that it's open to misuse?
Of course it is. And the reason why, and let me say first, thanks for being here. I feel very comfortable in being here because I think we're talking about issues that affect all of us. And I don't see even the tech industry as they and opposed to we, the press industry or the content industry. I think we're all sitting in the same boat, and we have a shared responsibility to take care that the distribution of content is not being misused. And now back to your question. Of course, we, like Twitter and Facebook and Google and many other in that area, give people a voice, right? So it's much, much easier than in previous days to spread your opinion across the globe. And that creates a lot of opportunities, but also creates a risk of misuse. So we need to cover both aspects. We should give people a voice. That's very important, and that it's something we should not forget in the debates around fake news and misinformation. We're here to protect content that is legal. But on the other hand, we need to make sure that it is not misused in an illegal way or in an inappropriate way. So we're always in between these two human rights. I mean, I'm a lawyer, so I can refer to human rights here. It is always taking the balance between free speech, free expression, and access to information, and then also the protection of other rights, the rights of individuals, of groups, and so on and so forth.
If I can turn to Philip from Swiss Ofcom, you're probably best placed because you're the agency in Switzerland where people have concerns, they can voice them. I think we all have a sense now that this is an issue for the man and the woman on the street. It's not an industry issue. It's not an academic issue anymore. But can you give us a sense of the kind of points people make to you when they're expressing their concerns?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Good morning, everyone. Maybe at the outset, I would be specific in also the scope that Ofcom is dealing with. I mean, we're not a government agency that deals with content. We're not looking into content complaints. Quite to the contrary, we have, of course, regulatory functions for the media world, but we're certainly keeping off the content issue. And so I think we look at this in a wider perspective in terms of the framework that is in place within which the information spreads, how people inform themselves. And I think, of course, clearly the phenomena that we see internationally, we also see them in Switzerland to some extent. But I think we also have to be mindful of the specific settings a society is in. If we look at our system, how it works, how people form their opinions, it's a very diverse system. There's, of course, has a lot got to do with the way our state, our country is structured, how society interacts and works together, the experiences that we have made, and also the continuous exercise in forming your own opinion. Mm-hmm. So yes, people are concerned, of course, specifically then about issues that may become relevant for courts, that may be based on criminal law, that may be also violation of personal rights, fundamental rights, and the like. And I think it's important to acknowledge, whilst not at all diminishing or minimizing the issue, that there are today remedies that people can use if their rights are infringed. So I think that should not be forgotten. There's a very elaborate also jurisprudence of the Swiss courts. What can be done in these situations? And then is the question, beyond that, with the new phenomena that we have, of course, with the new digital channels, communication channels, what needs to be done on top of that? And there, I think, in Switzerland, we tend to avoid regulatory overreactions, let's put it that way. In general, of course, then it depends very much on the field. And the topic we're talking about today is absolutely key for the functioning of our society. So in that sense, there is concern among the population, but I don't think there's panic or there's a feeling that, by and large, it no longer works, the system no longer works when it comes to forming your own opinions.
And just by way of background for some of our visitors, one of the reasons why this is particularly interesting in Switzerland is because we tend to have referenda, well, it seems every 2 or 3 weeks at this stage. So
every quarter, let's say.
Every quarter. So there's a lot of these heated debates that do play out on social media. Of course, then there's the term fake news, and it's not a term that I particularly like, because when I went to journalism school, there was news and then there was something we used to call lies. I know at France Télévisions, Pascal, it's something that you've been taking very, very seriously. How do you deal with this phenomenon for your audience and remind them that you are people that need to be listened to, and that when you guys say something, it's different to something that just pops up on their Twitter feed or on their Facebook page, and we've left them an empty chair just in case they show up at the last minute?
Well, as many big companies, broadcast companies, and especially as a public service company, we of course have to face this huge amount of fake news coming from everywhere, as many people in this room, I think. Of course, it's quite difficult because we are slow. The world where you live, guys, on Twitter and Google and Facebook. Facebook isn't here. It's a shame. Of course, you are very fast and we are very slow. So That's one of our problems as far as fake news are concerned. So of course we had to train to make our journalists train. There are 10,000 people in France Television. So it was quite difficult to organize, but we managed to do it, and we are still doing it. We are looking for alliances with other medias. We are EBU members, of course, and we are part of Journalist Trust Initiative. We are also a member of Crosscheck. I don't know if you know Crosscheck. It's an organization which tries to make us faster as checking facts. And we also try to deal with startups and many companies who work on big data, on algorithm, to try to be faster. And the other part of what we are doing is media education. We have the goal to be one of the leaders in Europe on media education with France TV Education, which is a website. I think it's a main issue as far as harassment and fake news are concerned.
Pascal, you're outlining very practical things that can be done. And if we look at how we should react to this problem, at the EBU, and I'm not speaking for the EBU today, but there is a sense here that when our members' logo appears on a Twitter feed or on a Facebook page or on Google, that members of the general public regard their state broadcaster in most cases as a very legitimate source of news. But there's another side to that. People who buy into fake news regard official mainstream media, if you want to call it that, as the enemy. So how do you go about convincing these people that what you're reporting is unbiased and factually correct when their very first instinct is to look at you and say, actually, you're the enemy?
Yeah, we of course, one of our reflexes, as I said, was to look for alliances. Jean-Philippe de Tander just said before that we have to be united in front of these phenomena. Yesterday, very interesting speakers said many times that we have to be together. And of course, I agree with that. But my point is that there is a risk. There is a risk of creating self-proclaimed labelized media group, which could be considered by the people who are the main victims of fake news as an official media group. When we cover fake news, for example, on France 2, we have a section called Faux et usage de faux, which try to explain, to describe fake news and try to look for those who have interest to broadcast this fake news. But the problem is that the people who believed us before. And those who usually don't believe us, they don't believe us because, not because of what we are saying, but because of what we are. And we are not able at this moment to target them. That's our main failure at this time, and I'm quite sure that every big broadcast company in the world have the same problem. And those people who don't believe us because of what we are simply the main victims. So this is one of our limits. We are mainstream, and it's our force, and it's also our weakness.
It's almost gotten to the stage where using the term mainstream media almost sounds like a criticism in some quarters. If I can move on to you, Nicole, it's not difficult to argue that access to unbiased information is a really important fundamental right. And yet sometimes sloppy journalism actually plays into this this really toxic discourse around things like ethnicity or migration. I know your organization has been looking at this and you've come up with some practical solutions. What kind of approaches have you pushed for?
Just in very briefly, I'm coming to your question right away, but to you, Mr. Haller. Of course, the Fundamental Rights Agency is also looking at these issues from a rights-based approach. Fundamental rights, human rights, we can name it. I mean, fundamental rights is the EU expression for human rights, you could say. But one of the main issues, which I didn't mention earlier on, is hardly anybody reports these incidents. So the difficulty is, yes, we may be aware of it, but the reporting of these incidents, people who are affected by it, is very, very low across the board, from women, or be it from Roma people or Jewish people, and that is the difficulty as well. Do people actually speak up when they have faced online harassment? So that was just a point which is, I think, very important to take into account, because this means that the figures we have are only to a certain they're reliable, but they do not show the overall extent of the phenomena.
It's the tip of the iceberg.
It's the tip of the iceberg, and that is where we are frequently looking at. Again, the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights is not giving policy recommendations. We look at what should be done to protect people or make sure that everybody can actually live in a dignified human life in the EU, which is one of our core values. So what has been done? For example, with regard to online hate speech, we were invited by the European Commission to participate to the subgroup, and now it becomes really complicated, an EU talk, to the subgroup on looking at racism and related intolerances in the EU. And with that, we contributed to establish a code of conduct against hate speech online. And this code of conduct has actually borne its fruits, you could say, because as we have found out, is that IT companies, so service providers, I don't have specified names here, but I would say that Facebook, Twitter, and other social media channels are part of it. They have, with that code of conduct against online hate speech to which they signed up, they have started to remove that. And our report, which will be published tomorrow, says that in 2017, 70% of the illegal hate speech, because there is illegal hate speech, not everything which is freedom of speech is legal. I mean, one needs to look at that as well. There are rules, what you can say and what you cannot say. So 70% of the illegal hate speech of which IT companies were notified were removed in 2018, compared to 59% in 2017, and compared to 28% in 2016 when the Code of Conduct came into place. So this shows companies are doing something and it has an effect. And it's only a Code of Conduct, and I say only because it means companies sign up to it on a voluntary basis.
Sometimes when you hear a debate like this, you could be forgiven that it's all kind of motherhood and apple pie, and we all agree on it and we're all working on it. And yet, when you look behind the curtain a little bit, it's not quite the case. We've been talking about the EU Code of Conduct, and there are very strong suggestions that during the negotiations for that things got a little bit hot and heavy. There was a suggestion at one point that the remedy for fake news on social media platforms was to actually have it investigated by the Competition Commissioner, so to make it part of an investigation into their business model. And again, they're not here, unfortunately, to defend themselves, but the suggestion was that Facebook and some other platforms took this very, very badly, and from Facebook there was a not very veiled threat that they would pull their money from the various different journalism projects that they've been involved with. So I suppose if I could ask Stuart and Arnd in particular, are you guys very difficult to deal with from a regulatory point of view? And I'm putting that in the politest way possible.
If we're difficult to deal with, so I refer to that balance that we're in, and we feel that balance every day between freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and protecting rights. And sometimes the regulatory debates are focusing on one aspect, which is remove illegal content fast. And I can totally sign up for that. So that's easy, and that was never the problem during the conversations with the European Commission. And by the way, with many, many governments around the world as well. We're not just talking about the European Union here. That's the easiest part, right? So when we're obliged to remove illegal content, fine, that's good. The problem starts when other requirements are coming in. So one requirement is remove illegal content fast, and sometimes fast means super fast. There are legislative proposals out there. One comes from Germany, by the way, where we are required to remove clearly illegal content within 24 hours. Sounds kind of okayish from a public policy point of view.
And even for people from a broadcasting background, the idea that you would leave something in place in a program that was problematic, unchallenged, for 30 seconds is a problem. You know, if this was a debate in an election somewhere and you were a far left or far right candidate, I'd be obliged to jump in immediately and say, actually, what you've said is nonsense. So 24 hours seems ludicrous.
Yes, yeah. If you take it from the content producer perspective, fine, it is your content that you have produced. If that content is illegal, you should remove it fast. We're a neutral platform, right? So we look at the content for the first time when it's notified to us. And then we need to decide, is that content illegal or not? That is a legal question that usually has to be done by a judge who's legally trained, who can differentiate between illegal content and legal content. And don't be confused, this is not red versus green. This is often a gray area, right, in between. Most of the content that is like on the line of maybe it is illegal already or maybe it's not yet, this is where the problem starts. And what do we need to do as a private company in these situations? That's typically the problem with regulators. And if we are required to remove fast, we remove fast. But the consequence is that we also are required to remove content that is probably illegal. That is probably, legal. Okay, right? And then we're in the business to infringe human rights of giving freedom of speech and giving freedom of access to information a platform as well.
You wanted to come in?
And yeah, maybe just to follow up, I think Arne covered all the legal basis, so that's good. And I'll talk about just coming to the table. I think that's the first step for any discussion, especially when it gets into more of these difficult issues around disinformation, which isn't illegal content in some cases. But for the majority of the issues that we deal with, hate speech, for example, terrorist content, countering violent extremism, we've been the first to come to the table on and discuss with partners, civil society, and institutions. Codes of conduct are part of this, and also just having open dialogues. And I think just having those initial discussions on what are the challenges we are all seeing and having a good forum to build trust and then take it forward from there, I think those are always a good step to say, okay, this is where we are, this is where we want to be. How do we start to fill that gap? There's legislation that can help sometimes to create clarity, create understanding of what boundaries we need to address. But I think having these first discussions are always good progressive steps. This code of conduct, I've been involved with a number. Hate speech is a good example of something that took a long time, and it has progressed over the years, and obviously with the right and due criticism. But it has progressed because that trust has been built in that area. The code of conduct on disinformation is something that's still growing and still looking to how we can collaborate more. And I think we have to move beyond this idea that, you know, a societal challenge needs to be faced within a competition environment. It has to be that societal challenge needs a societal approach and bringing all the elements to the table. As Pascal mentioned, like looking at more collaborations across the board. We worked with the EBU around the EU elections to host the Tell Europe debate online, and we had over 2.5 million views just on Twitter alone, which which is crazy to think of these numbers. And just looking at how we can better address some of the concerns that we see, not just within our sector, but in every area, because we see journalists on our platform using it to respond to information that's misleading in real time. And how do we make sure that their voices become more credible in that process?
Philip from Swiss Ofcom, if I can bring you in on this. Again, there is this sense that the online world moves at a particular pace, and the regulatory world and the judicial world moves at quite a slower and steadier pace. As somebody who has the overview of that in Switzerland, how do you see a way of resolving that, or is it something that we just have to allow play out?
I think if you look at it from a strategic point of view to start with, in terms of the digitization that's going on, of course, we see that in the first place as an opportunity, whatever it is. And then you don't want to necessarily regulate right away before something has developed. So there has to be leeway for things to develop. And then, of course, you have to make sure the framework will be strong enough so that you can react. And I think, frankly, if push comes to shove, often the legislators, the parliaments, they can be quite quick in enacting things that are really pressing and that really matter to our population. So of course, there has to be also maybe some instruments could be developed in how you apply secondary law, and then what happens with co-regulation. So I think the dialogue that both of my colleagues here have mentioned to my left earlier, I mean, that has to be intensified, that has to be more structured as well, because it is a relatively new phenomenon. So you can't expect that you can just, with the stroke of a pen, just produce a perfect solution, enact it, and that will all be fine. Because often I think what people tend to forget, if you put yourselves in the shoe of a regulator, the application of the regulations can be extremely complicated and very difficult. They're challenged in court and so on. So that will take a long time as well if you don't get it right in the first place. So I would really say that it's important that we're moving on several fronts in parallel. I think if you look at the information topic again, I think it's important, if I look at it from a Swiss perspective, that we stabilize what we have. We have a quite stable system today. And we want to make sure this is, in a sense, can be sustained in the future, which is not easy because there is a lot of economic pressure on the more traditional actors that play an important role. And of course, public broadcasting, I'd like to say that here at EBU is a key aspect in that as well. The private media actors as well, the journalistic quality that we have, amongst also the private editing companies. And then, of course, there are aspects like media competency, education. And then there are also, I think, more research needs to be done on particular aspects that play an important role here. I would just mention artificial intelligence. I don't think right now we will be capable of just producing within a few weeks a possible governance model, how we deal with AI in journalism. That needs to be more thoroughly researched, I think. And we need to, of course, engage much more with the platforms that we have done in the past. And I mean, agree, we're all in this, we're in the same boat together up to a certain point, because at one stage, people will look at the state, will look at government and will say, well, they didn't play ball, these platforms, you have to do something now. So of course, there is a particular exposure for me as somebody who's representing government to come up with solutions if co-regulation or self-regulation attempts fail. But those have to be intensified, and that's what we're doing as well.
But it's interesting, even in Switzerland, where the tendency for all of these things is to have quite light-handed regulation, there is an appetite for this sector to be monitored. We're very tight for time at this stage. So if I can, it's very rare that we get people from of this caliber who will take our questions. So there's three questions I can see. I think this gentleman had his hand up first. You might just tell us who you are first before you start.
Okay, my name is Johannes Hahn, German Television, ZDF. I'm based in New York, and I have two questions, actually. Too bad that Facebook is not here. We did a report before the European elections about so-called suspicious accounts. There was a research done in the US by researchers from the George Washington University, and they found out that there were more than 200,000 so-called suspicious accounts. We confronted Facebook with that. They said, okay, our code of conduct, we will check it, but we can get a report only after the elections. So now, after the election, they found out that most of them are really fake. This is not real humans. They spread misinformation and propaganda all over the place. So why isn't it possible to stop these accounts from being active before important elections? Question number one. Question number two, for Twitter, directly, we had the Tiananmen anniversary yesterday. And before that, there was reports in the US that all the Twitter accounts of the Chinese dissidents were blocked out. So how can this be? Twitter acted very fast to get rid of all these accounts, Chinese dissident accounts, while it's not very quick in removing accounts which are fake and suspicious.
You can always tell a television reporter because they managed to get two questions into one. That was very impressive. Who'd like to tackle that? This was the Twitter question in China. On one level, you can move very quickly. That's the allegation. And then on another level, not so.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and thank you very much for the questions. Yeah, I'll answer the question one. The second one regarding the Chinese dissidents. We came out with a tweet to kind of explain what happened in this situation. It was obviously a mistake, but it's something where we're checking accounts on a daily basis. So we check over 10 million accounts a week, essentially just to flag them to make sure that they are actually people behind them. So essentially we're removing almost 10 accounts every second for either inauthentic accounts or just people not behind them. And they could cover everything from spam or misleading or anything in between. And that spam could be everything from commercial to politically motivated. This was obviously a mistake, and we rectified it as quickly as we could. But these things do happen as we are trying to be more proactive in addressing the concerns that you've raised around potentially fake accounts. We want to make sure that we're also putting the remedies in place. And some of the stats we came out with recently that were 6 times quicker in providing remedies to any kind of accounts that have been wrongfully taken down. But these do happen from time to time, and we have to be politically sensitive to those.
I think the argument is that people might like to see that speed enacted ahead of a political event.
Of course, but as you rightly pointed out, the quicker we become, the more chances there are for some of these incidents to take place. So we want to make sure that we're taking a paced approach and actually getting those bad actors that are looking to cause harm in any kind of discussions, and really looking at the behavior behind the accounts and looking how they're coordinated rather than just the content themselves. And I think that's where we're trying to double down on our efforts.
Okay, there's another question over here.
I'm Daoud Kuttab, Palestinian journalist. I noticed that a lot of accounts are often, especially Twitter and Facebook, they're not here, are taken down quickly, and then after protest, and they're put back on. And I feel that the kind of pro-Israeli Hezbollah are very good at knocking down anybody who makes any kind of anti-Israeli statements, even though they're legitimate, and then it takes us a long time to get them back on. So I think you should not only weigh the number of people who complain, but also that not everybody who's attacking Israel is doing illegal or hate speech.
I suppose the argument there is more of a journalistic approach to do it, to how it's policed, that it's not just the majority view that holds sway against a minority.
Yes, that's a great point, and I think that's one of the challenges that we actually face is how do we make sure that we are providing the safeguards in the place for journalists and for political speech. One of the reports that came out recently, I think it was from the Demos think tank, really looked at some of the large data sets that we made public following the midterms elections, and identified that a lot of that content was just amplifying media and journalistic content to kind of manipulate a discussion. So taking journalistic content that might be anti-migration or anti-certain countries and just amplifying that. So from our perspective, how do we make sure we're taking action on those accounts, but without interrupting the journalistic freedom there? We see this in the case of Christchurch as well, where we saw that 70% of the accounts that were sharing either the video or links to the video of the shooter or the manifesto were coming from verified press accounts. And that put us in a little bit of a bind when we have timelines and takedown requirements from different countries. How do we start to address these concerns? And this comes back to the point around collaboration. How do we make sure that we're all aligned on our goals and making sure that when something does come up, that we understand the sensitivities, who's involved in the process, and making sure that we can better identify when certain issues or reports are coming in, that those are actually malicious in other cases. So I think building those relationships and having those points of contact will be beneficial going forward.
Okay, really good question. There was one, or there's several more.
Yes, I have a question for Pascal. My name is Peter Ford. I'm with the Christian Science Monitor. Pascal, you were saying that you've run trainings programs for your 10,000 employees. What sort of skills have you found you've needed to teach them to deal with fake news, and particularly what sort of skills that they didn't learn at journalism school? Thank you.
I should have bring the documents we share in our company, but unfortunately I didn't. I'm not sure to be able to explain that in English, but there are some techniques. For example, the most simple is invest research on Google, but of course there are some applications, and we publish a document with the 15 main techniques we think are the most useful, and we change it and we make it evaluate every 3 months. Because of course this world is fast, and it improves every time. So I can't be specific at this time, but if you like, I can make some research and get the document to share it with you. Of course, it's not a secret, but I'm quite incompetent at this time.
Okay, yourself, please.
Leif Lunsman, Independent Media Advisor, and actually formerly a Vice President here at the EBU for radio. I like to bring a transnational schism into the question of removing illegal or probably illegal material from transnational platforms. And I bring a case to which I would like you to reflect upon. In my country, which is Denmark, it's legal to propagate National Socialism, Nazism. I can do that legally, and to remove it, I would consider censorship. A few kilometers south, across the German border, Danish-German border, it's illegal to bring exactly the same information on international or national platforms. That's a dilemma one has to face when demanding regulation and removals from international platform providers. Because what is illegal, removal of illegal material in one country may few kilometers further south or north or east or west be censorship, which is unwanted. And fake news is often defined in the hands of the censors or the regulators as unwanted news. I have no answers to this dilemma or schism, but I like the panel and the regulators to reflect on that.
Okay, tusen takk. That is an issue, isn't it? Because that which is not necessarily illegal, strictly speaking, can be unpleasant, immoral, or offensive to people. So how do you do that internationally?
Can I get that question, please?
Yeah.
It's a wonderful question, and it's exactly the example that we bring up all the time. Illegal does not mean like every society would agree that this is something bad. It is a regulation for a specific country, and there is not a commonality in all of the countries around the world. And I think as a global platform, we need to live with that. What would be a bad answer is if we apply just our own rules, right? So what we have come back with is to do both. We're giving ourselves global rules. So whenever something is against our rules, let's say pornography on YouTube. We just think pornography has no place on YouTube, although pornography might be totally okay in some countries. But we as a platform have decided to do so. It's very open, very public, so everyone knows that we are removing pornographic content. But then when it comes to other stuff, like you said, like political speech that might be legal in one country and illegal in another country, we take a different approach. We say, okay, then we remove that content from this particular window into our platform. So that YouTube video, for example, is then removed in Germany, but not in Denmark. And we need to target the audience via IP address. So Are you from Denmark? Then you see that content. Are you from Germany? Then you will not see that content. And that's not our decision. It's just our response to the fact that the law is different in every country.
And of course, there's a very easy way for anybody to get around that with the VPN if they're so disposed. There was one other question, the gentleman there.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Christoph Plata. I'm the director of the Sub-Saharan Media Program of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation based in Johannesburg. And we do a lot of work on fake news and on legislation in African countries, media legislation. And very often we come across the concern, and that is a question that I would like to address to the two reps of Twitter and Google, across the concern that legislators in African countries say, well, if you look at the network enforcement law in Germany, for example, Twitter and Google and Facebook, you know, they salute and they obey and they cooperate. But we in Ethiopia or we in Ghana, what influence do we have? I just wanted to find out, would you say there is a growing awareness of also taking serious those concerns in countries that might at the moment not be as economically attractive as others for you?
That's a point I've heard echoed by even some of our members within Europe, that there's a sense that if you're a German media organization and you're dealing with yourselves, it plays out a certain way. If you're working for an organization in a smaller country, it's more difficult to get access and it's more difficult to get your voice heard.
I don't know. I mean, it's a little sad if you have that impression. It shouldn't be like that. Because I think content regulation has nothing to do with economic pressure you can put on social media actors. We really want to obey the law of every country, and if a country in Southern Africa comes up with that sort of regulation, I'm pretty sure we will try exactly the same approach. And by the way, content regulation is not something we're discussing just here in Europe. The Asian markets, Singapore, for example, is a very interesting one because they have looked at the German NetzDG as a copycat and as a role model for what they wanted to do. And they came up with something totally different, which is far more aggressive. If you haven't paid attention, that is very, very interesting because in Singapore, we are even obliged to redact content that is wrong if the Singaporean government tells us to do so. So it's not a removal request, it is a request to change the content on a website that is not ours, but a third-party website. So that is the most extreme law that we have seen so far. And we try to comply with the law as well, although we don't like the law per se, as you can imagine. So, and Singapore is not a big country. I mean, it's economically not comparable to some of the African countries, that's clear, but it is a small country and we try to comply wherever we are.
Was there one other question? Go ahead.
Is there a way, Google, for example, we know is extremely sophisticated in terms of predicting our behavior for advertising. Is there a way to deploy all of that data to look at the networks of disinformation and be predictive in that as well?
You might just tell us who you are as well, if you don't
I'm
mind.
sorry, Maria Ressa from Rappler in the Philippines.
Thank you, Maria.
Well, I don't know how good we are in making these predictions, but what I can say is that we do see a certain responsibility on our end not to finance the players in the market who distribute fake news and disinformation. Because if you can make a business from spreading disinformation, let's say through online ads on their site, through very clickbaity content that everyone just wants to see, and then they're making money with that content, that is not in our interest at all. And what we try to do is to identify those and to demonetize them so that they're not in the Google network of earning money with bad content. We really try to get them out of our way. They might still pop up in search so you can find these websites, but they're not making money through Google. And I think that's a very important approach.
Okay, have we got time for one more quick question? Sorry, the lady there.
Hello, Aleksandra Karasińska from Newsweek Poland. I have a follow-up to this question because we are talking about regulations in different countries, and you said that the bad content, the fake news content is actually not good for the company business. But the question is about the algorithm itself. It's a very secretive thing. The algorithm, we don't know how. This is the secret of the company. But what we can observe and what researchers are saying about it is that the calm, balanced content, objective content, is not actually driving the attention of the viewers, while the fake news, the anger and fear driving content, which is the bad content, is driving attention, which is actually profitable because it is driving the time spent on the site, on the platform.
The argument that it's a profit-driven algorithm that's giving these people prominence.
Would you comment on that? Because you said that it's not good for your business, and I disagree, actually.
Okay, I have to get you both to do this very briefly, or else I'm going to be in very, very big trouble. Isn't that right?
Okay, maybe let's go to our mission, right? So what we try to achieve is to make, to organize content globally and to make it accessible and useful. And we think that disinformation is typically not useful for the user. So we don't want to point users to disinformation, because at the end of the day, it is not useful for the user, it's not useful for the societies. And we really try to take the money away from that business by demonetizing these websites. There's no algorithm at Google that refers users to the websites where we generate the most money. There's just not, because that would be a very not a long-term sustainable business model. We really want people to come back to Google.
Very briefly, right? I've no doubt that you're telling the truth, but I also suspect that a lot of people don't believe you. Why do you think that might be?
What a rhetorical question.
I know, it's good, wasn't it?
You're probably given the answer yourself. More
maybe
transparency.
some more transparency about the algorithm.
That's fine. I mean, I'm totally up for that. I don't know. I mean, we're always confronted with that concern. We're not transparent enough with our algorithms. And the typical comment that I have made to many people in these discussions is, do you know the website How Search Works? Which is a good starting point, which is online since many, many years. And not even journalists have a good understanding of that website. And then there are many, many, many more documents out there explaining our algorithms. At the end of the day, like the last pieces are indeed confidential because we don't want to share them with our competitors at the foremost. This is the secret source of the search algorithm. But there is a ton of information out there, and I think it's more than most people can digest, actually.
All right, the finish on time algorithm is telling me that our time is up. I want to thank you all very much for taking part today. Pascal, very quickly, very quickly.
Sorry for the delay, but I just found the document that I told you about. I can share it with you if you read French.
Okay, there you go. Thank you very much to the panel for joining us today in Geneva and giving us your insights. Thank you very much to you guys for your attention. You've got a great program ahead of you for the rest of the stay here in Geneva. I hope you enjoy it. Thanks again.